Good afternoon. I'm thrilled but not surprised to see such a large turnout today. It's my distinct honor as Vice Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School and Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics to introduce our featured speakers of today, Senator Jeff Flake. As most of you know, Senator Flake was U.S. Senator from Arizona from 2013 to 2019, and prior to that, he served 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. While in the U.S. Senate, Senator Flake chaired the Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and Law, which sits at the intersection of innovation and regulation. He also chaired the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health Policy of the Foreign Relations Committee. And as part of that, he worked to pass landmark legislation on wildlife trafficking and democratic governance. Senator Flake was the lead House Republican in the successful effort to prohibit earmark spending, and the lead Senate Republican in the successful effort to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba. Prior to entering Congress, Senator Flake served as executive director of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, a conservative and libertarian think tank. He also directed the Foundation for Democracy in Namibia during that nation's transition to independence. Currently, Senator Flake is a contributor to CBS News and partners with CBS on a series called Common Ground, which I'm sure many of you have seen. He's the author of the recent New York Times bestseller, Conscience of a Conservative, A Rejection of the Destructive Politics and a Return to Principle. He's visiting the Woodrow Wilson School today as a part of the Leadership and Mentorship Program. He's here today with his wife, Cheryl, and we're absolutely delighted that both of you could be here today with the Woodrow Wilson School, and we'd like to give you a very warm welcome to Princeton University.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad, I guess, to see a full house here. It makes me a little worried, too. But it is nice to be here. I wasn't mentioned, but I grew up in a very small town in northern Arizona called Snowflake. If you're wondering how a town in Arizona could be called Snowflake, let me tell you. It does snow there. It's up at the elevation on the northern plateau. But in 1878, my great-great-grandfather made his way to Arizona from Utah, sent there actually by Brigham Young to colonize the state for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He bought a little valley there, and he hadn't named the settlement. He was going back up to Utah to get some cattle to pay for it, and he ran into a man named Erastus Snow on the trail, on the wagon trail, who was kind of involved in colonization for Arizona. He said, Erastus Snow said, "What have you named this settlement?" He said, "I haven't named it." He said, "Call it Snowflake for the two of us." And he did, and that's where I grew up. I come from a family of, I have 10 siblings. I have 69 first cousins on my father's side alone. That's how I got elected. Not really joking there, but it helps, believe me. But I grew up in Snowflake not knowing that flake was a pejorative term. Nobody made fun of us there. But I soon realized that wasn't the case. I had to go to another place where there are plentiful flakes, and Congress was about the only option, I think. But anyway, in Snowflake, I grew up. My dad was the mayor of Snowflake for a while. It's a town of about 5,000 people now. But I grew up not believing that there was a big difference between Republicans or Democrats. In fact, in the early days of Snowflake, in the days of the church there, the Mormon church was concerned that maybe too many members would be aligned with one party or another. So one day they went along, and in the pews, I would say, those sitting on the left this week, you will be Republicans. Those on the right, Democrats, or vice versa. In Snowflake, those living east of Main Street would be Democrats. Those west of Main Street would be Republicans. The flakes were east of Main Street. So up until really this generation, my predecessors were Democrats. But it was in a small town like that, you just got along and you got things done. My father was mayor, as I mentioned. My Uncle Jake Flake of Snowflake, I'm not kidding there, was a Speaker of the House in Arizona for years. And so that, like I said, it was comfortable there to be a Flake. But after a Mormon mission in Southern Africa, I ran right to Hawaii, as every Arizona boy ought to do to get to the water. Went to college, my first semester at BYU, Hawaii. They have a campus on the North Shore. I ran right to the beach my first day of school, and there was a beautiful girl there sunning herself, and I introduced myself. She laughed at the name Flake, and now I got the last laugh. Cheryl and I dated and were married. 7 years later, we went back to that exact spot where we met on the beach, and we reminisced about going to school there. We then drove up to the school, which is just right close to the beach. And this is true. I said to Cheryl, I said, this has changed quite a bit. I said, that's a new building there on the right. She said, no, that's the library. She said, that was here when we were, but it was new to me, I can tell you that. After going to BYU in Provo, we got a little more serious about school. And then after a graduate degree, I went to Washington. We went to Washington to do an internship to finish my degree. I did it for the senator from Arizona, one of those, Dennis DeConcini. At that time, I was obviously a Republican, but I didn't think twice about working for a Democrat. He was doing more foreign policy at the time than John McCain was. So I thought I'd be a better fit there. Things have changed a bit in the way that I was a bit naive, I will admit, at that time, but still partisanship has become more important, I guess, or more of a thing. And we'll talk some about that. After a couple of years in Washington, Cheryl and I were fortunate to go to the country of Namibia. I had been in Southern Africa for 2 years before, but we were in Namibia for the time that Namibia gained its independence from South Africa. It was a one-year transition period. Let me tell you, for a political junkie to be there when a country has its first election and writes its constitution, that is nirvana. It was a great and wonderful time, and I remember what really sticks out at that time. Namibia had the good fortune of becoming independent right at the time that the Berlin Wall was coming down. In fact, the week of the Namibian election was the same week the Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union was shedding republics by the day, and freedom was breaking out all over the world. What I really remember at that time is getting Time magazine, a copy in February of '90, and reading an address by Václav Havel, the newly minted president of Czechoslovakia. Just a few months before that, he had been in prison. Now he was president of one of the newest democracies in the world. They printed the entire speech that he gave before the U.S. Congress, before a joint session of the U.S. Congress. In it, he poured out his gratitude for the United States, for the example they were for the world, for what they had done to liberate his country for a second time. And he spoke glowingly. It was a long love letter to the United States for our moral example to the world. And I never forgot that, and that really heightened my interest to serve my country. And it motivated my service ever since. What he really talked about was the indispensable role that the United States has played worldwide. That role, in my view, needs to continue. Let's talk about the topic of today. Is polarizing partisanship the new normal? In other words, are the better angels of our nature permanently on furlough? It sometimes seems that is the case. And many of us will ask ourselves, is it really worse today than it has been in the past? I would argue that yes, it is. I was reading Mo Udall's journal a while ago, or his autobiography. Mo Udall was a congressman from Arizona, served early in the 60s and 70s and 80s, ran for president. Very humorous man. But he was writing in that book about traveling to Arizona. He said, our office budget will allow us to travel home to the state we represent, 3 times a year. At that time, when you were elected to Congress, in the House or the Senate, you moved your family to Washington, and you raised your family there. And the children of Democratic members of Congress and Republican members of Congress typically went to the same schools, played on the same sports teams. The families socialized together, recreated together, worshiped together, and the bonds that they built on the weekends outlasted the partisanship of the weekdays, and people were able to get along. There's an old saying in Washington that if you know, you won't question your colleague's motives if you know the names of his children, and his or her children. And I can tell you, too few of my colleagues today know the names of their colleagues' children. And that has been to our detriment. We've been going in the wrong direction with regard to partisanship for a while, but now it seems to be accelerating. Early in my time, I was elected to Congress in the year 2000. When I first got to Congress, there was an issue that was mentioned in the introduction that really motivated me. It was Cuba. I always thought that Americans ought to be able to travel wherever they want unless there's a compelling national security reason otherwise. And there was no compelling national security reason why Americans couldn't travel to Cuba. And besides, I thought, if you want to get rid of the Castro brothers, just make them deal with spring break once or twice. That would be just punishment. But I was able to pass legislation a couple of times early on to lift that travel ban or to prohibit spending to enforce the travel ban, technically. I couldn't get President Bush to sign it. Later on, I'll talk a little more about it, but during one of the early debates, when I just got into Congress, I was on the floor of the House arguing that Americans ought to be able to travel to Cuba. And I got a lot more support from the Democratic side of the aisle than I did from the Republican side at that time. And when I was arguing that, one of my Cuban-American Republican colleagues stood up and said, "The gentleman from Arizona just wants to lift the travel ban so he can drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba." And I'll never forget David Obey, a longtime Democrat from Wisconsin who had chaired the Appropriations Committee, stood and demanded that those words be taken down, words be stricken from the record, because I had been slandered in his view. So they have to stop the proceedings and read through it again and go through a process, but they finally took it from the record and we went on, and I was able to pass the amendment. But I went over to Dave Obey. I had never seen then and seen very few examples since of a Republican standing up to protect a Democrat or a Democrat to protect a Republican. And I said, "You really don't know me. Why'd you do that?" And he said, "Flake, I know you're Mormon. I know you don't drink." He said, "I was just protecting your honor," he said. But there were many examples at that time, far more than we have today, of members being able to protect other members' honor. Later, not so much. I remember well when my colleague Gabby Giffords was shot. She was holding a constituent event in Tucson outside of a supermarket, and she was shot and gravely wounded. A few on her staff and a federal judge and a few others were killed. It was an awful time. She had a long recuperation, and 1 year later, well, I should say just after she was shot, a few days later, we had the State of the Union address. Myself and several of my Arizona colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, left an empty seat in her honor in the middle of us. 1 year later, she came back to that State of the Union, her first time back. And she was still recuperating from her injury. I sat next to her, and obviously you see State of the Union addresses when it's a Democratic president, and Democrats will often cheer, and when the president has his applause lines and vice versa. Well, she wanted to stand when President Obama was speaking. And so many times I helped her up. She couldn't get up on her own, which left me, a lone Republican, standing in a sea of Democrats. I immediately started getting texts and emails and phone calls from angry Republicans saying, "How could you stand? Do you actually agree with President Obama?" And I thought, this is partisanship out of control. A little later, when Tim Kaine was selected as Hillary Clinton's vice presidential nominee, Tim and I were elected in the Senate at the same time. He was a proud Democrat. I knew him well. We'd worked together. His son, Nat, was a Marine. And I knew him to be a patriotic, honorable member of the Senate. So just to be playful, I tweeted out, now I have to count the ways I hate Tim Kaine. I said, but I'm drawing a blank. He's a good man and a good friend. Congratulations. Immediately, angry texts and emails saying, how could you consort with the enemy like this? And I was at an event in Arizona just a couple of days later, and I still remember one man stood up, it was a Republican event, and said, that tweet you sent out was uncalled for. If you can't say anything bad, don't. He stopped himself right before he reversed all the good advice his mother, I'm sure, gave him his whole life. But that is what happens when things are out of control in a partisan way. Just a year and a half ago, I was on a baseball field with the Republicans practicing for one of the best bipartisan institutions still in Congress, the congressional baseball game, when a shot rang out, where all of us stood around. I was standing between home plate and first base, trying to figure out what that was and where it came from. And not long after, a volley of shots rang out, and our third baseman yelled, "Shooter, shooter." Steve Scalise had turned to run and was hit immediately. And I turned to run, and several others. I ran straight for the dugout. It was the only place of refuge that I could see. I remember more than anything that day, I just remember seeing bullets pitch off the gravel in front of me and thinking, why us? Why us? How could someone look out at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball and see the enemy? And such is the conditioned response of a shattered politics. That was a long day. Gratefully, Steve recovered. As soon as the shooter was down, a few of us ran out. I used my baseball glove to plug up the hole in his hip, and then used his phone to call his wife so she wouldn't hear it from the news. But we are out of control in terms of partisanship. Why is it so difficult to come to the middle, to defend your colleagues across the aisle when you should be defending them? I would argue that virtually all of the political incentives are now wrong. On any given big issue that we deal with in Congress, the political incentives say, rush to your tribe, rush to the extreme, plant yourself and don't move. If it's any big issue out there, whether it's debt and deficit or climate change or Kavanaugh or you name it, anything, the motivation is to rush to your corner and don't indicate for a minute that you might be open to persuasion, that you might change your mind, that a hearing that you might be chairing might inform your view or your vote, that an investigation that might be occurring might be dispositive. You might take it into account, because as soon as you do, then you're hit from both sides. And it's not a comfortable place to be in. None of my colleagues want to be placed in that position. I've lived in that position for about the past 2 years, and it's not a comfortable place to be. Somebody asked the other day, what's the best part about retirement? My wife quickly said, no death threats. Yeah. And unfortunately, that is the case. There's a Chicago man who was just sentenced for leaving a voicemail saying that he would take me and my family out for obstructing the president's agenda. The man who was caught sending pipe bombs to CNN and to several members of Congress and others. And when he was caught, they took a look at his hard drives and found out he was the author of a tweet in which he put a picture of our house an aerial photo of our house in Arizona with the words, this was just a few weeks before he was caught, "Senator Flake, there are a lot of entrances. I'll see you soon." And so people don't want to be in that position these days. So if you rush to your corner, plant yourself, just say, "I'm with my tribe," that's less likely to happen. You won't be hit from both sides. And the threats have come from both the right and the left. What is our responsibility as elected officials? What can we do? When I got to the Senate, I was so disturbed by the partisanship, the rank partisanship that I was seeing. And I thought, well, take some extreme measures. I should back up a little bit. 10 years ago this summer, I lived a lifelong dream that I'd had. It's a strange dream for a kid growing up on a dry, dusty ranch. But I loved to read sailing adventures. I just longed to be where there was water somewhere. I always wondered if I were marooned, if I especially liked sailing adventures gone bad. That was my favorite genre. I always wondered if I were marooned on a deserted island, could I survive? And my wife, Cheryl, got so tired of hearing me ask this question that she finally said, "If this is your midlife crisis, would you get it over with? Maroon yourself on an island." And so I did. I picked an island on Google Earth and in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the Marshall Islands and marooned myself there alone, just with no water or food, just a few tools to spear fish and light a fire, and it was a wonderful time. It's a it's a great diet if you want to try that too as well. But I enjoyed it so much. A couple years later, I took our two youngest kids, who I said, if we get through this Senate race, we'll go back to the island. And we really enjoyed that time. Similar situation. But then when I got to the Senate, I was there for a year, and we were having long votes on the floor one night, and I was talking to Martin Heinrich, a Democratic senator from New Mexico. We had served in the House for a few years together and were elected to the Senate at the same time. And we both had the same feeling that we ought to show that Republicans and Democrats can get along. So we said, let's go back to that island, you and me. Let's prove that we can get along. Well, we thought, you know, there's a cable channel that does a lot of survival shows. Maybe they'll be interested. So I went to Discovery Channel and said, we're going to take a GoPro camera along on this little adventure. We're not telling any of our colleagues we're going. It's going to be a quiet thing, but would you want some of the footage when we get back? They said, no, we want to come with you. We want to film it. We said, this can't be Naked and Afraid. They agreed, no, not that. So Martin Heinrich and I marooned ourselves with a camera crew that wouldn't give us any food and water, believe me, for 6 days and nights in the Marshall Islands. We survived. No food, no water, not even a desal pump, just a machete between us. That was about it. Can you imagine sending Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell to an island with a machete between them? We got back, went on the Senate floor. None of our colleagues, not one, knew that we had gone. That we went around on a lot of the talk shows and talked about how we needed to be more bipartisan. The one thing we really wanted were to have some of the Senate lunches that we have bipartisan rather than each party meeting alone. And we got some of that. But we went on some of the shows. Stephen Colbert played a clip of us spearing fish and came back and said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So, for what it's worth, it's been empirically proven now, so I don't have to do that again. But there are, every once in a while, examples of people coming together and members of Congress willing to defend the other side and see the other side of the aisle as less than the enemy. There used to be a tradition in the Senate and in the House, but mostly in the Senate, called pairing, where if one member of the Senate had an unavoidable conflict, a family emergency, or some reason they had to miss a vote, and if their vote would not change the outcome on a big, important issue, And a Republican would say, if a Democratic member had to leave or vice versa, a Republican would say, I'll pair my vote with yours. I'll vote the other way so that your vote wouldn't have mattered to the difference. Just as a way to say, I'm with you, we respect each other. It used to be a common thing. It hasn't happened in a long time in the Senate, but just a few months ago, when the Secretary of State had been nominated by the President in the Foreign Relations Committee, we considered that nomination. And we came to a vote. It was a party line vote. Johnny Isaacson, who's in pretty frail health, or it was at the time, had to be away to deliver the eulogy at his best friend's funeral. So he was unavoidably absent when the vote was scheduled. And the question was, would we have to force him to come back in the middle of the night and keep everybody there? And then Chris Coons stepped up and said, I will pair my vote with his. It won't change the outcome, because if you delay it, he'll come back, and it will be, and I'll do that out of deference to my friend Johnny. Just remember, it was so unusual that Bob Corker, chairing the committee, openly cried at this gesture of bipartisanship. We don't see enough of it. There are some issues where we've seen bipartisanship spring out as well. One of which was criminal justice reform just recently in December. This is something that had been percolating for a while. We worked on it particularly in the Judiciary Committee, a bipartisan group of members. But finally, we reached a point where we said, we can do this. People put partisanship aside. They didn't worry about what it would say to their constituents, or people worry about, would this give the president a victory or not? It's the right thing to do. Let's do it. So there are examples of where it can happen. I hope that it does happen more in the future. Before going to questions, I'm often asked, I'm sure I'll be asked about perhaps what my most memorable time in Congress was or has been. And one that comes to mind immediately is on the Cuba issue. I mentioned in the early 2000s, I was able to pass legislation a few times to lift the travel ban. I couldn't get President Bush to sign it. And by the time President Obama came and would sign it, I couldn't pass it anymore. So we had a bit of a dilemma. But President Obama lifted some of the restrictions, what he could do by executive order, reversing previous executive orders to allow Cuban Americans to travel, and then most Americans after that. But we couldn't go further and have diplomatic relations, which I thought was important, and to do a few other issues until Cuba released an American that they were imprisoning, a man by the name of Alan Gross, who was a USAID contractor who was trying to bring more information to the Jewish community in Havana. Cubans had been monitoring what he was doing, caught him, tried him, convicted him, and jailed him. And he was jailed for 5 years. Tom Udall from New Mexico and I went down to see him in prison in November of 2014. He was in very frail health. He'd lost about 100 pounds, and he said at that time that he would not spend another birthday in prison, that he would take himself out. I still remember he looked up at the glass panel over him in the cell that we were in. The Cuban government's obviously watching. He said, "You hear that? I'll take myself out." And he had had enough. I went home and went to the White House and said, if you're not negotiating for his release, you better hurry. And they had been. And a few weeks later, I got a call from the White House and said, could you undertake a sensitive mission? You can't tell your wife or your staff where you're going. And they did the same with Pat Leahy of Vermont. We'd been working together on this issue. They said, could you be at Andrews Air Force Base at 5 a.m. on Wednesday? This was a Monday. This is on December 17th of 2014. So we showed up there and climbed on one of the president's planes. And there was Judy Gross, Alan's wife, who we'd been working with to try to secure her husband's release. And we took off toward Cuba. Right after we took off, another plane took off from Andrews Air Force Base. It was to pick up a Cuban national who had been a spy for us, who was caught and had been in prison for about 20 years in Cuba. it was to pick him up and take him to parts unknown. Another plane took off about a half hour later from Miami. It had 3 Cubans who had been convicted of spying in the States and had been jailed in our prisons for about 6 or 7 years. We all 3 planes landed at the same time in Havana at different airfields. This was like an old Cold War era spy swap or prisoner exchange. We got off the plane, went in and greeted Alan Gross and saw him reunite with his wife. Then met briefly with the Cuban foreign minister and went out to the tarmac. And exactly 31 minutes after we landed, we got the signal that we could take off. And we took off, and I'll never forget, and this is my favorite moment in Congress. The pilot said, "We've now entered U.S. airspace." And Alan Gross stood up and put his fist in the air and just cheered. And then just breathed in and out several times and said, "Now I know I'm free." It was a wonderful moment. It reminded me again of why I entered public service and what a wonderful country we have here that's worth fighting for. That this partisanship of the moment that we're experiencing needs to go. This extreme partisanship. There will always be partisanship. It's part of the process. We can agree and disagree, but we can't consider those on the other side of the aisle enemies. Lincoln's admonition in his second inaugural, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell again when touched, as they will be by the better angels of our nature." I hope that we again can come to a time when we'll heed the better angels of our nature and treat those on the other side of the aisle better than we do today. Thank you for having me here. I'm glad to try to answer any questions you might have.
See, in this auditorium, we don't have microphones, so please state your question very clearly so that everyone in the auditorium can hear it. Questions? Yes. You can stand. Yes, stand. That will help everyone hear you.
Thanks so much for this really remarkable kind of almost a call to end this bipartisanship, but.
And the partisanship, not the bipartisanship. I was thinking maybe I said it wrong. I don't know.
But you just left the Senate. You retired from the Senate. So what was the reasoning for that? And then how do you see your role in the Senate? Versus out of the Senate, kind of from the outside looking in politically, but perhaps you have more freedom to come to events like this. So what is the reasoning for that?
Well, thanks. There is no doubt. When people say, "Well, I left the Senate so I could have more influence out of the Senate," no, you have more influence in the Senate. Yeah. I would have liked to have stayed a second term in the Senate. I've been in Washington 18 years. That's not a short service, but I had planned and thought I'll run for a second term. But I couldn't reconcile what I would have to do to stay there. And every politician trims the sails and speaks maybe differently to different audiences. That's part of politics. I understand that. But for me, I felt that I would have had to accept positions that I simply could not accept, Muslim bans and a position on immigration and trade, and then condone behavior that I simply could not condone. In the end, to me, running successfully for re-election would have required me to stand on a campaign stage with the president and to be okay with people shouting, "Lock her up," or to be okay with him ridiculing friends of mine and others, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. So that's, I admire those who are there. There are good people on both sides of the aisle who are trying to do what's right. But for me, that's where I came down. So thank you.
Yes, in the t-shirt. Yeah.
So relatedly to what you were just talking about, it kind of reflects a change in incentives, the types of things you have to do and everyone has to do to stay in office. Kind of, you have to take those stands, whatever those stands are for your particular party. How do you change the incentives so that more people have the incentive to kind of be the one that stands in the middle? You still see a few people like Susan Collins, for example, who are willing to kind of stand in that middle more often and take that fire from both sides. How do you either reduce that fire from both sides or create something different where you don't have to run into your corner so much?
Mm-hmm. Well, that depends on all of you, really. I mean, it won't change until the voters value those who will occasionally stand in the middle, and those who don't ridicule or demean their colleagues, but rather meet with them, sometimes compromise with them. It's, we were headed this direction before, but 24-hour news cycle and social media added up just exacerbates it considerably. I can't emphasize too much how social media, Twitter and whatnot have changed it. I was struck the other day when I've been very critical of the president when he's used crude language and been vulgar in referring to his colleagues and whatnot, and I've voiced it. So when a Democratic congresswoman used very vulgar term to say that the president ought to be impeached, I on Twitter said, there's no place for this in politics. There should be no place. The fact that the president uses such language should not be licensed for people on the other side of the aisle to do so. Within 2 days, there were 30,000 comments on that post. And the majority of them, they were from all over, but the vast majority of the comments were to the effect of, if the president speaks this way, then so must we. And so I can't emphasize enough how much the change that we need, it may not be sufficient, but it is necessary to have a president who will not engage in this kind of polarizing behavior and not exacerbate the situation and feed on it and use it for his or her advantage. So you need a leader at the top who will do that. It's tough to think that we'll get beyond this time without that, but it needs to be more than that. We've come to a point where people feel that they should have license because somebody did it, that they have to do it as well. So I think until the voters and others will basically reward politicians or the incentives change for them to act in a different way, then politicians will act this way. That's a good question. I wonder about it all the time.
Yes, in the...
Can you talk about the fear that people have of retaliation from our president that really kind of makes them pause and really go with their tribe, and that really, I feel, that contributes to this divisiveness?
Sure.
And the fear is really what, to me, is what is preyed upon with his base.
Sure. Re-election is a pretty big motivation. And to get through a Republican primary just about anywhere, to be skeptical of the president, let alone critical, is something that nobody wants to do. Why pick that fight? And people do worry a lot about an action they take or words that they say that might prompt something, or retaliation, or a tweet from the president. So that's very real. I don't know if that will change in the next year and a half. I just don't. I had hoped that some of the things that were said in the campaign by the president about my colleague John McCain or about minorities or others might change. It hasn't much. So I think that there have been a few courageous members who have stood up and still stood their ground and said the president is wrong here or there. But by and large, many have just said, I'll remain quiet. And I in defense of my colleagues, if you were to refute everything the president says, you get tired, really, of responding to every tweet. And when you're chased down the halls by reporters who want you to know, your response to the last presidential statement, it gets burdensome and you really want to get away from it. But when the president goes so far, sometimes I think you have to speak out. When he referred to the press before he started to qualify it, which I don't accept the qualification anyway, that the press is the enemy of the people, echoing the words of some of the worst dictators in the world, and giving license to current dictators to use that same language now to refer to their own press and to silence their own opposition. Things like that, when the president says it, I think it's our responsibility as incumbents, as Republicans, I can speak for, to refute that, say that's just wrong.
My name is Steve Nolan. I spent 30 years in the military, and I'm an Afghanistan veteran. And why I picked that fight is because these same individuals are willing to send 18, 19, 20-year-olds anywhere in the world, Iraq or Afghanistan, to be killed, to be maimed, and they don't have guts enough to stand up for what is right, especially the only oath they took, same as the military, to defend the Constitution, like the enemy. The press is the enemy of the people. I want to commend you first, because in 2 years of watching this obscenity, I've only heard two voices that, to me, meet the occasion as far as proper language. That was Senator John McCain saying the President of the United States went to Helsinki and abased himself in front of a tyrant. And your speech to your colleagues, where you said, if we accept what is clearly abnormal as a new normal, then we are complicit in what happens. There's going to be a question at the end of this.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, we do need to keep the, yeah.
No, go on. I like this. I mean, that's...
I cannot believe that Congress was okay with expelling 35 Russian spies, 25 indicted, 12 of those were Russian military officers, which that 100% proves Putin's involvement and direction, does it not? Of course it does. You don't have to be in the military to know that one. And then they vote, well, plus you got Manafort and Cohen and what's his name, getting indicted, convicted in prison sentences for this. But you voted 517 to 5 to impose more economic sanctions on Russia for this cyber warfare, which is present tense, not past tense. And they still, most of them, except for people like you, who, this is a definition of patriotism, what you're doing, most of them have allowed for 2 years to allow all of it to be called a hoax, fake, and a witch hunt. And so what am I, here's my question, what am I to make of those so-called leaders in Washington? Do I get pejorative? Are they traitors? Are they cowards? What are they when they can't stand up and just do what's right and say what's right and say a lie is a lie, it's not fake, it's not a witch hunt, it's not the enemy of the United States people? I see no leadership except for very few. And please don't stop talking, because you may be few, but we need these voices desperately for this obscenity that's going on in this country at this time. Sorry it took so long.
Thank you.
There was a question, though.
Well,
with these people who allow daily, really, with Twitter, these massive lies, and that's, I heard you address that in your speech, is that it's the lying about these critical issues.
well, like I say, you can't expect them to respond every time the president utters an untruth, but the big ones the ones that the enemy of the people, for example, or some of those statements that affect our policy and standing in the world. And I think you ought to, call on your members of Congress to condemn that. And don't be shy about it. So they need to hear it.
Thanks. We have a question right up front.
I was wondering if you think partisanship kind of reflects some of the shortcomings, some of the fundamental shortcomings of the system of liberal democracy. By that I mean there are a lot of discussions today, I guess in Princeton, a lot of professors, a lot of theorists sort of write books are proposing new overarching political ideology and frameworks that sort of maybe seek to address those issues such as divisiveness, populism, even technological changes like AI down the road. So do you see any fundamental shortcomings of liberal democracy? Do you see it being replaced by a new human narrative a couple decades down the road?
No, I don't think this is a problem of the rules. I think it's a problem of behavior. And I think that the rewards and incentives, politicians respond to rewards and incentives. What they desire most as a whole is to be in office, to continue in office. And as soon as they realize that constituents, that the voters won't reward that behavior anymore, they'll change the behavior. I would hope that some would step out and say whether they're going to reward that behavior or not, I'm going to do what's right. And I think some have. I know some have, on both sides of the aisle. But it needs to happen more frequently. I don't think there's a problem with liberal democracy. I think it's a problem of behavior right now and incentives.
In the far back, and then the next up. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Mitch McConnell, can you speak on him a little bit? Because sometimes I wonder, does he have something with you guys? What makes you so
Mitch McConnell, does he have something on us?
What makes him so effective, and do you agree he's bad for the country, and how do you read us of it?
No, I don't think he has anything on anybody. That's not it. He's a leader. Some would call him an effective leader. He's been able to move legislation or nominations or whatnot. But Mitch McConnell is the leader, and he's the leader because the senators have voted him there. I liked a lot of things that he did. I didn't like a lot of things that he did. But I don't think he's, some will cast him as the archenemy of everything. No, he's not. I think that he responds to incentives that are out there and wants to keep his position, and obviously wants to keep Republicans in power so he can have that position. But people on our side will use the same words of demonization for Chuck Schumer. That's not true either. It's people leading their parties in a time when they think that this is what it demands. And they're responding too often to the other side and what they would do. We have to change this rule because the other side will do it as soon as they get in, for example. Those kind of things. I can tell you what would be healthy is in the Senate, you need 60 votes, gratefully. We need to keep that rule, no matter who's in charge. The filibuster rule on legislation is one of the instruments that's still there that brings the parties together and guards against pieces of legislation passing that, like in the House, sometimes in the heat of the moment, that should have been cooled by the saucer, like George Washington referred to. So I hope that the Senate rules don't change more. I hope the behavior changes. It would be healthy for a member on the Republican side or the Democratic side to get a few friends on the other side. All you have is, you have to have 6 or 8 people who could assert authority and create a different power center in the Senate. It would be very healthy. And I'm not saying it has to be led by a Republican or a Democrat, just a group who will say, we're not going to go along with this. That would be healthy. I don't think we're going to come to a time where more states, or not anytime soon, where more states have a tradition like Vermont or Maine, where they elect independent senators. I think that would be more healthy if we had more, but even if they don't, Republicans and Democrats, and we have gotten together to form certain gangs. You know we're in a bad place whenever a bipartisan group is called a gang, like it's some illicit activity that we're involved in. But certain times gangs will develop, and they'll say we're not going to change the rules on this. We're going to keep and preserve the institution of the Senate. That needs to happen a lot more often. And then people like Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer won't have the power that they do. And we have concentrated far too much power in the leadership of the Senate and not let the committees work as they should, because that's where bipartisanship happens. Just take one example. What I became so frustrated by is we wanted to pass legislation to protect the special counsel. The president had said, you know, it's a hoax and whatever, and had made threats to get rid of the special counsel, and then he fired his attorney general. I thought it's high time we do this. In the Judiciary Committee, we had in May of last year passed on a bipartisan basis legislation to protect the special counsel. Now some made the argument that's not constitutional, they had questions there. Fine, vote against it. I thought it was vetted well enough where we ought to do it. But we went 7 months and still could not get a vote on the Senate floor on something that had passed with 4 Republican votes in the committee, including the chairman of the committee. So that's the frustration that you're expressing, is that so much money, or so much power has been concentrated in the leadership in the Senate, and that's a deviation from where the Senate has been in the past.
You've been patient in the white jacket. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm also from Arizona.
All right. How many? Who else? Anybody else here? Oh, okay, a few at least.
Just a question about our home state is, with the election of Kristen Sinema and the appointment of Scalise this past midterms, what do you think, do you have a forecast, so to say, on the shifting political climate within Arizona right now, and do you think that is representative across the board in other states as well?
Okay. In Arizona, the senator who placed me is Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat, who had served in the House and ran against Martha McSally and won, and then Martha McSally was appointed to fill the remainder of John McCain's term. Arizona has about a 200,000 person registration advantage for Republicans. So it's still nominally a red state, but it's not a really Trumpy red state overall. You have, as you have in most states, the Republican Party, those who vote consistently in Republican primaries, they are squarely with the president. The polls you see show 90% or 85% with the president among the president's base. Those are pretty accurate. But that doesn't translate to wins in a general election. In Arizona, by and large, and this wasn't the case in every race, but almost, those Republicans who ran statewide, usually if you're running for mine inspector, for example, that people don't pay much attention to that race. If you have an R behind your name, that's enough, you're in. But if you're running for one of those lesser known offices and you showed up at the president's campaigns or campaign stops and were on that stage with him, you lost. Those who kept their distance, the Republicans who kept their distance from the president, asserted some Arizona independence, won. So it's not that Arizona has shifted that much, but it has, in my view, gratefully, asserted some independence. As you know, you have Goldwater and McCain, this is something in the water in Arizona, gratefully. So it's tough to be, this is a quandary that Republicans are in Arizona. It is very difficult to get past a Republican primary in the state if you express any skepticism about what the president is doing, or heaven forbid, criticize his behavior or policies. It's tough to get by a Republican primary. But if you are one of the president's acolytes and express undying support for him, it's almost impossible to win statewide in a general. So that's the quandary that Republicans are in, and I would suggest it's going to be that way a year and a half from now when Martha McSally has to run for re-election. And so people like Martha are in a difficult position. Do you court a primary, or do you stay with the president and face a tough general? Because there's already a Democrat running in that seat. And so Arizona's in a tough place, and that's similar to many other states. I don't think Republicans have fully internalized the whipping we got in November. When you look across the country at California, with not one Republican representing Orange County, if you look at Nevada, where every statewide office was swept, and I think even supermajority in one of the houses there, New Mexico, every statewide office swept, and then losing 40 seats overall. We kept the Senate, even a few more Republicans, because of a very, very, very favorable map this time. But I'm very concerned about the direction of my party, and I think that another 4 years of the president in office would really, I mean, you can look at 4 years as an aberration of some type, but 8 years, it's more of a shift. And I look as a corollary at California. If you remember recent history there, in 1994, Pete Wilson was a Republican governor of California. He had been a Republican senator. That was back when they elected Republicans statewide in California quite often. But there wasn't much excitement for a second term for Pete Wilson. So all of a sudden out came Prop 187. It was a ballot measure that was really tough on the illegal population, and really, it was a way to protect California residents from the menace to the south. And it ginned up and got people excited, and voter turnout was bigger for Republicans, and he won a second seat. But it also turned many Californians off of the Republican Party, particularly minorities and immigrants and women and people in the suburbs. And since that race in California, only one Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, a different kind of Republican who later switched to independent, and an insurance commissioner. Over 25 years, they're the only two statewide elected offices that Republicans have won. And they probably won't win another for a generation or so. That, in my view, is what Republicans are courting if we continue to embrace this kind of nativist, protectionist appeal, and not try to appeal to a broader electorate.
We have time for, I think, one more question. You're in the Princeton shirt, so that always helps me.
So I was wondering, to what extent within the Republican caucus was there pushback on the decision not to grant a vote to Merrick Garland? Because to me, that's one of the big inflection points on the increase in partisanship.
Okay, the question was, to what extent was there pushback in the Republican Party with regard to the decision not to consider Merrick Garland? There was some, but in my view, not enough. And I think that was one big mistake that we Republicans made. And I felt that I met with Merrick Garland, and when the election was coming, I, like everybody else, thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And I had actually drafted a letter which I was going to press send the day after the election to Chuck Grassley saying, let's consider his nomination, Merrick Garland's nomination. We never got there. I felt that, I think that a lot of the vitriol that we have now between the parties results from decisions like that. And I would have certainly acted much differently than had I foreseen that. And I should say, this decision by Mitch McConnell was not unprecedented. Some say that that had never happened. You'd have to go back to 1888 to find an example of where somebody nominated by a different party was actually considered in the last year of a term. So it wasn't that it was unprecedented, but it wasn't right. And we Republicans would be better off long term, certainly had we made a different decision.
Thank you so much for these fantastic.
Thank you.